Does Ukraine have a problem with neo-Nazis, with far-right ethno-nationalism? It is one of the most controversial aspects of this war in Ukraine. When the Russian government proclaimed one of the objectives of the war was to denazify Ukraine, many people around the world treated it as propaganda. Leading advocate of Ukraine, Timothy Snyder, whose work has informed the Ukrainian government and many of the responses to Ukraine, who has championed the cause of Ukraine, wrote in February 25 by his Substack and also via the website of the Ukrainian World Congress that Ukraine resists an unreality war. Putin's premise for invasion is that Ukraine does not exist. There is no state, no nation. Ukraine is just a misunderstanding that can be corrected by violence and propaganda. And so the country was to be occupied. The children were to be re-educated, and everyone with any sort of political involvement was to be murdered. The Russian lies told for foreigners returned to that basic premise of non-existence. Ukrainians want to be Russians because they do not exist. The Ukrainian government is illegitimate because there is no Ukrainian nation that could have elected it. We call the Ukrainian government or Ukrainians Nazis, not because that has any basis in reality, but because that would justify eliminating them. But the question is, does Ukraine have a neo-Nazi problem? Is there a basis in reality for the claims? Does the claim that powerful Ukrainians use Nazi ideas and symbols have some basis in reality? I asked Ukrainian historian Marta Havryshko, does Ukraine have a neo-Nazi problem? And will that neo-Nazi problem soon seek refuge in Europe? Here is this highlight from the extended 100-minute interview with Marta Havryshko on this crucial question of does Ukraine have a Nazi problem?
So basically this war, I mean, especially after 2022, empowers so many neo-Nazis and far-right groups, and they openly promote their agenda. They openly celebrate Nazi units. They openly celebrate Wehrmacht. Why? Because their ideology is those guys are lesser evil because they fought our eternal enemy, meaning Russians. So, and they compare themselves with Nazis. So it's not Putin only who compared them with Nazis, but they themselves compare themselves with Nazis, and it's ridiculous. It's just crazy. Why do you need Nazi insignia to fight Russians?
Yeah. This raises a really interesting issue, which we might come back to a bit later, which is how some of this extreme ethno-nationalism, I'm going to call it, but might sort of spill over to particularly European societies, especially given Europe has had some issues with managing, integration of migrants and
Yes.
people from different cultural groups in recent years and a lot over history. You raised the sort of statement from Vladimir Putin that part of the objective of the war is denazification of Ukraine, and that's been quite controversial from particularly in Western audiences. There's been a lot of pushback from that. There's been a lot of in a non-judgmental way, Ukraine supporters in the West have said, this is just Russian propaganda. You can't say everyone in Ukraine's a Nazi, that sort of thing. How would you describe the nature of the far right Nazi ethno-nationalist problem in Ukraine at the moment? I mean, you've already
Okay.
given some insights into it, but specifically, is it something people should be worried about?
Actually, I want to admit that this Putin's argument about denazification of Ukraine as his aim actually played a huge role in all this denial that is happening now in terms of, Ukraine far-right groups, because people believe if Ukraine is a victim and Ukraine is a victim of Russian aggression, that you should challenge all talking points of aggressor. And partly is true. You should be conscious that we are living in informational war, which is a substantial part of this war of aggression against Ukraine. And Putin, of course, he instrumentalized the memory and the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Of course. Why? It's obvious, for example, this obsession with the Great Patriotic War in Russia, the celebration of Victory Day. And they have this, in Russia, in many cities, they have this immortal regiment when people crossing, marching across the streets, and they, carrying the portraits of their great grandfathers who fought Nazis. And what is interesting, from 2022, some people whose relatives died in the front line in Ukraine carried the portraits of their relatives, meaning they made a clear link between this, war against Nazis and between Russian war against Ukraine. Why? Because goes in line with this official Russian propaganda about Nazis in Ukraine. And Russian official propaganda, Kremlin propaganda, tries to present this war as a continuation of this war against Nazi evil, and against those Nazis who are in Europe and they want to conquer Russia and all this stuff. So basically, it's a pure instrumentalization and propaganda. But it doesn't mean that Ukraine don't have so-called Nazi problem. We know that Nazi groups are everywhere, basically, and now they are so empowered and now they are flourishing everywhere. But in Ukraine, there is Ukraine is very specific in this regard. Why? Everyone who is trying to you know to argue that Ukraine has no Nazi problem. For example, make arguments about this. The latest parliamentary elections when united Nazi nationalistic parties gain only 2% of voters. But the problem of Ukraine democracy, in quoting Marx, is that nationalist groups in Ukraine, they exercise power not through parliamentary, not through seats in the parliament. They exercise their power like nationalists exercise their power in Weimar Republic, in streets. They threaten politicians, they threaten prosecutors with violence against them and their family members. They threaten President Zelensky by developing, this no capitulation campaign against him, while they put pressure on him not to basically implement Minsk agreement that was partially a problem later for Ukraine that led to these complications with Russia. So basically, nationalists in Ukraine they even before 2022 they were empowered, because let's take Azov movement. It wasn't just some marginal political movements, some marginal party. This movement was sponsored by the minister Avakov. That they were sponsored by oligarch Kolomoisky. They got a lot of ammunition, a lot of uniforms, a lot of everything. They organized, Ukraine even before 2022 became a hotbed for neo-Nazis. the famous, the famous concerts of so-called nationalist, socialist, national, so Nazi black metal music were transferred from Hungary to Ukraine. And they were networking with different neo-Nazis across Europe, and they developed this idea of intermarium, meaning idea that European countries should unite and resist to both American imperialism and Russian imperialism. So they obsessed with this idea of white Europe, actually white Europe. They always refer to white Europe. That's why they are anti-Muslim, anti-Arab. They are also anti-Semite, because they believe, they are proponents of this great replacement theory, that the Zionist lobby that controls everything brings Muslim to Europe to weaken Europe and to emasculate Europe, and and they pose the threat to white women. They want to impregnate them. They want to weaken white masculinity. So all those conspiracy theories, all these anti-Semitic theories, they are still in place. And after 2022, they even developed. Why? Because we gain present with Jewish origin, and many people refers to Jewish background of Zelensky as an argument why Nazism can be in Ukraine. But for me, it's like an argument that there is no racism, systemic racism, and daily racism in U.S. because U.S. had a black president. It's the same argument, Under Zelensky, the first march commemorating Waffen-SS Division Galicia that took place in Kyiv was in 2021. Before that, those marches were primarily in Galicia, in Western Ukraine, where basically Galicia, this division was formed by Nazis, But for the first time, under President Zelensky, it took place, in our capital, in Kyiv. And I want you to pay attention to this Hunka Gate. Maybe our viewers remember that in 2023, a former member of Waffen-SS Division Galicia, Yaroslav Hunka, was given standing ovation in Canadian Parliament, and our President Zelensky, I was very happy to celebrate him. Of course, I believe that Zelensky wasn't aware who actually this guy was, but I am not sure if some, Canadian politicians who are heavily involved in connections with Ukraine diaspora, especially those who have Ukraine background, like Chrystia Freeland, I doubt that they didn't know who this guy is, So my suggestion is that it was their attempt to finally legitimize this, heritage and legacy of Waffen-SS Division Galicia. And what was the reaction of President Office? His, team, who is responsible for combating disinformation, they started to whitewash the Division Galicia. They started to release statement. Of course, Division Galicia wasn't involved in any crimes, but according to the Shen Commission, some members of Division Galicia members were involved in massacre in Guta Poniatska, in suppressing bursts of uprising, in anti-partisan actions in Slovakia, for example. What does it mean, anti-partisan actions? It means fighting civilians, because all partisan groups rely heavily on civilians. And we know that, Alti Rodal, while preparing this, report for the Shen Commission in Canada, she indicated that those, hundreds of former Waffen-SS Division Galicia members, they were not subjected to precise security check during this procedure. So Canada just let them go because it was the Cold War. And we remember how during Cold War, CIA and other countries, MI6, they instrumentalized Nazi collaborators from Eastern Europe, from different countries,
mm,
forest brothers from Baltic states. They even attempted to instrumentalize some people in Belarus, without, of course, without major success. But Ukrainian Nazi collaborators played a huge role in this,
mm.
in these, games during the Cold War. So nowadays,
Indeed, a Bandera was kind of taken out by the US effectively and
exactly,
deported post-war
exactly,
by the intelligence
exactly,
agencies
and
effectively. Yeah.
the Voice of America radio,
Mm,
Hollis America, many people who work there, they have had connections with, Bandera movements, with, Waffen SS. I remember in 2020, when I visited Ukraine church in Washington, I met some guy who used to work at Hollis Voice of America radio, and he approached me and asked me, what are you doing here? Oh, you are Ukraine, from this big Ukraine, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm a fellow at the USHMM, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, because I'm studying Holocaust in Ukraine. And he said, the, the Holocaust is a fairy tale. Do you know this? This is Zionist fairy tale, because Nazis couldn't have enough gas even to suffocate 6 million Jews. And I was like, I was trying to to collect myself, and
yeah.
to react in decent way, because I was new there, and I was surrounded by all these nationalists, people in Vyshyvanka, and all this traditional clothing, and I was really I felt really threatened, um,
Mm,
but he was introduced to me as very respected member of Ukraine community, who carry who is defender of Ukraine national interests, and so on and so forth. So I was shocked, how
mm,
many people still in diaspora, they cherish this nationalistic myth.
mm,
And I remember at the same time I met one woman, and she told me, yeah, I remember during this Demjanjuk trial, remember this Nazi collaborator from
mm,
Nazi concentration camp who was accused of, he mistakenly was accused to be Ivan Grozny. He wasn't Ivan Grozny, but still, I recommend this film, Something Next Door.
uh-huh.
Documentary, remember?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Wonderful documentary about Demjanjuk. But what is really important, that he actually was a guard in Nazi concentration camps. And this lady told me, we used to make dumplings and to sell them after, after service, church service, to Ukraine community, to raise money for his lawyer, because he
Mm,
was innocent. And I was left speechless.
mm,
I was left speechless.
mm,
I
mm,
understand why Ukrainians were so, were so desperate to prove that he wasn't innocent, because it
mm,
was the entire issue of they struggle with this Russian Soviet propaganda about that wanted to discredit the entire Ukraine national cause, but at the same time they basically put their efforts in advocating real Nazi collaborator. And
mm,
according to many testimonies, he was really involved in real crimes, not just
mm.
he was basically willing executor of Nazi will.